Long before the name America echoed across the world, vast lands stretched from the icy tundra of Alaska to the warm waters of the Caribbean, inhabited by millions of people who had built thriving civilizations. The continent was not empty or wild, it was alive with culture, trade, and spiritual harmony. The Navajo, Sioux, Cherokee, Iroquois, and countless other nations had lived for centuries, building societies that valued balance with nature. In Central and South America, the Maya, Aztec, and Inca empires built magnificent cities, developed advanced calendars, and mastered agriculture long before Europe's explorers knew the world was round. These were civilizations of art, science, and community, rich in wisdom and tradition. But across the ocean, Europe was restless. The 15th century had ignited an age of discovery, driven by ambition, greed, and faith. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain and landed on Caribbean shores, he opened a new chapter that would change the world forever. His arrival marked the beginning of European colonization, which brought explorers, soldiers, and settlers from Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands. What began as exploration soon turned into conquest. Entire native populations were destroyed by disease, war, and enslavement. The Spanish claimed vast territories, building missions and seeking gold. The French explored the Mississippi River, trading furs and forming alliances with tribes. The English built colonies along the eastern coast, where new towns emerged from Virginia to Massachusetts. The 1600s were years of hardship and growth. The first successful English settlement, Jamestown, survived famine and conflict through determination and the help of local tribes. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock seeking religious freedom and built a society rooted in faith and survival. Life in the colonies was harsh, forests had to be cleared, crops planted, and homes built in an unfamiliar land. Yet over time, 13 colonies grew along the Atlantic coast, developing their own governments, economies, and identities. A new culture was emerging, one that mixed European traditions with the realities of the New World. As the colonies prospered, tensions grew with Britain. The crown demanded taxes and obedience, but the colonists wanted freedom. By the mid-1700s, ideas of liberty and self-governance began to spread. Voices like Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Adams spoke of independence. The colonies resisted British control, and their frustration erupted when Parliament imposed taxes without representation. Events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party fueled anger and unity. Then in 1775, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, beginning the American Revolution. Farmers and shopkeepers took up arms against one of the most powerful empires in the world, determined to shape their own destiny. The war was long and brutal. George Washington led the Continental Army through victories. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, America stood on the edge of transformation. The scars of the Civil War were still visible, yet the nation was rebuilding with a sense of determination and ambition unmatched in history. The Industrial Revolution reshaped the landscape, replacing farms with factories and horse-drawn carriages with steel locomotives that raced across the continent. The roar of machinery filled the air as cities grew taller and denser. Immigrants from Europe poured in, chasing dreams of prosperity. They worked long hours in dangerous mills and crowded tenements, believing in the promise of a better life under the Statue of Liberty's watchful gaze. The rise of industry brought new power and wealth to a select few. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan built empires of oil, steel, and finance, symbolizing the Gilded Age, a period glittering with success yet tarnished by deep inequality. Laborers toiled for meager wages while their employers amassed fortunes. Child labor was common, and strikes often turned violent as workers fought for fair conditions. Out of this struggle rose unions and reformers who began to demand change. America was learning that progress came with a price. Meanwhile, the spirit of expansion remained alive. The frontier, once declared closed, continued to inspire adventure and conflict. Native Americans, forced onto reservations, faced the erasure of their culture and land. The Indian Wars came to a tragic close with the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, marking the end of a long and painful chapter of resistance. Yet, America's hunger for influence turned outward. By the turn of the century, the United States had become an imperial power, claiming territories beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War of 1898 brought control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and influence in Cuba. America was stepping onto the world stage, ready to shape global events. The early 1900s were years of innovation and social change. Inventions like the automobile, the telephone, and the electric light revolutionized daily life. Henry Ford introduced the assembly line, making cars affordable for ordinary citizens and changing how people lived and worked. Cities lit up with electric power, and skyscrapers pierced the skyline. Women began to demand equality, fighting for the right to vote and a voice in politics. The suffrage movement grew stronger, and after decades of struggle, women finally won the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. As progress advanced, so did America's influence in global affairs. When World War I erupted in 1914, the United States initially stayed neutral, watching as Europe descended into chaos. But by 1917, after German aggression and attacks on American ships, the nation joined the war to make the world safe for democracy. Millions of soldiers crossed the Atlantic to fight in muddy trenches, and when the war ended in 1918, the 1970s dawned on America as a time of triumph and turmoil. The echoes of protest still lingered in the air from the Vietnam War, which had torn families apart and shaken faith in the government. The conflict had ended in 1975, but the scars it left behind ran deep. Veterans returned home to a divided nation, some hailed as heroes, others shunned and forgotten. The trust once placed in leaders began to crumble as the Watergate scandal unfolded, revealing corruption at the highest levels of power. President Richard Nixon, once seen as a symbol of authority, became the first U.S. president to resign. America had entered an era of disillusionment, where people began to question the honesty of those who ruled them. Amid political chaos, the country faced an economic crisis. The oil embargo of 1973 sent prices soaring and exposed America's dependence on foreign energy. Inflation rose, jobs disappeared, and the confidence that once defined post-war America began to fade. Yet, in the midst of hardship, the nation's culture continued to evolve. Music, art, and technology reflected the changing times. Rock, disco, and soul became the voice of a restless generation seeking meaning in chaos. The fight for equal rights expanded beyond race and gender, as Native Americans, Latino activists, and members of the LGBTQ+ community demanded recognition and respect. Movements like the American Indian Movement, AIM, and the Stonewall Uprising echoed the nation's oldest promise, that all people deserve dignity and freedom. The 1980s brought a wave of change. The election of Ronald Reagan marked a new conservative era, emphasizing free markets, limited government, and strong defense. Reagan's vision of "morning in America" promised renewal and optimism, but it also deepened divides between rich and poor. The Cold War entered its final and most intense phase. The United States and the Soviet Union competed in technology, weapons, and ideology, while the world held its breath. Yet, as the decade progressed, the Soviet Empire began to crumble under its own weight. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was more than the end of a structure, it was the end of an age. The Cold War had ended, and the United States stood as the sole superpower of a new global order. The 1990s became a time of rapid transformation. The digital revolution took its first steps as computers and the internet began connecting people across continents. Bill Clinton's presidency oversaw economic growth and globalization, but also new political scandals and the rise of partisan division. The decade was marked by moments of hope and tragedy, the promise of peace in the Middle East, the horror of the Oklahoma City bombing, and the celebration of technological progress. America was changing faster than ever before, stepping into a world no longer defined by war but by information and innovation.